Welcome to Real Talk. This is a live recording of Real Talk podcast where we have conversations about faith and doubt with real people. And I'm your host, Thea. And today I am joined by my friends and colleagues to have an honest conversation on why are Christians hard to love. We are recording live here at LitJava, a coffee shop and bookstore in Pearland, Texas, right on Broadway, next to Premier Cinema 6. Come check it out. It's a wonderful place. And we're excited to have this conversation. So let's start by you guys introducing yourselves and why you said yes to come on this podcast today and talk about this topic. Michael?
Well, hey, everybody. My name is Michael Geinger. I am a pastor down in Galveston, Texas, which is an island off the coast of Texas. It's not Texas, right? It's something different. So been there for about 10 years. It's a church that's trying to serve folks on the margins. So we are the largest provider of services to unsheltered persons in Galveston County. And it's kind of the who's who of everybody who's a nobody on Galveston Island, which makes it a lot of fun to do church down there. So, and I said yes to this because I would do anything for Thea, right? If Mike were to ask me, I would have said no, but Thea asked. So Thea and I went to seminary together, and I think having honest conversations are just so important when it comes to faith. I actually don't know how to have faith conversations without being honest, and so I just appreciate all the work that you're doing with this, Thea. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
And I'm Mike, and I've never invited Michael Geinger to go on a podcast with me before, but I said yes because I don't get to sit this close to Michael ever before. So glad to be here. I run an organization called Oikon. It is an online ministry that creates resources for spiritual formation. So we create music, liturgies, and teachings. You can check it out at oikonstudios.org.
And I'm Leah Gillam. I'm the owner and clinical director of Selah Counseling Center. It's a small private practice in Pearland. We focus on trauma and at times religious or spiritual trauma that people have gone through. Thea and I know each other from the gym, and we were just having a great conversation one day about the different strategies that Jesus used to reach people. And sometimes that's telling stories, sometimes it's flipping tables. So we're trying to figure out how can we use that example. And she asked me to be on the podcast, so I said, of course.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. I really value your time and your perspective and your willingness to make this be something you're doing today. So thank you for that. I'd love to hear from each of you just a little bit of your faith journey, maybe a few instances that stuck out to what's led you to where your faith is today. Leah, do you want to start?
Sure. I grew up in the church. I'm what's called a cradle Episcopalian, meaning I was in church like from day one. My joke growing up was you had to be dead or dying to miss church. So there was a lot of exposure to the gospel, to theology, that was just kind of baked into our life. And at 14, I think it was 14, I was at church camp, and they had invited a Baptist pastor. That year is very kind of a controversial decision. And I just got to hear the gospel from a different lens and understand that there's a difference between knowing about God and knowing God. So that just led to my decision to accept Christ. And then, in the book of James, it kind of talks about the road to spiritual maturity is kind of paved with suffering. So as I've gone through the ups and downs of life, that's really what's helped, you kind of build your faith and then it falls apart and you rebuild it stronger and then that falls apart. So it's just a cycle of building, and the areas that are going to be weaker come apart through different circumstances. So it's kind of my thing.
I'll go next. If you've ever seen that Netflix series called Beef with Steve Yeun and Ali Wong, that is, aside from like urinating on a stranger's bathroom floor, that is my entire life story. I grew up in an immigrant Korean American church context, evangelical context. My parents, whenever they would pray, it was very expressive, very loud. I'd always fear that they were going to pop an artery because they're praying so intensely. And kind of in that tradition, I found myself really taking my faith seriously as an adolescent through remnants of the Azusa Street Revival and the Vineyard Revivals in Southern California, the charismatic stream. So I was praying in tongues and prophesying for a good 5-6 years of my life. And then I decided to become a Christian nerd. and I went to this hoity-toity Christian seminary called Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. I discovered, prior to that, I had discovered that I was resonating with Wesleyan theology, and for the last 9-10 years, I've been a ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church, serving mostly affluent suburban Houston congregations. And then 3-4 years ago, I started a church entirely online, right in the thick of the pandemic. I don't recommend anybody to do this. And that church has since converted to an online ministry that creates resources for formation. So, yeah, I've gone from, I've served and been a part of Christian communities that are across the spectrum, from immigrant evangelical to white Southern Baptist evangelical, to, strangely, here in Texas, in Houston, in the South, I've befriended many progressive Christians here. And so, maybe surprisingly or not, I have been fortunate enough to find Jesus in all of these spaces, as well as the devil, but we'll get into that.
I'm originally from Connecticut, and so my parents were not church folks. They went to church as kids, didn't when they got married. And so when we moved from Connecticut to exotic Lake Charles, Louisiana, the easiest way to meet folks was to show up at a local church. And so there was a United Methodist Church down the street from where we were living. And so my parents brought me and my sister and became really involved in that church. Moved to Houston, began attending Clear Lake UMC. And that church was just amazing. My parents went through a pretty nasty divorce, and there was times when home was not safe, and so church kind of became a safe space where really it was like having another family that I could go to when things were difficult at home. So really fond memories of that experience, and really kind of where that call towards ordained ministry happened. I was on a mission trip in East Texas, building a wheelchair ramp for someone, and God spoke pretty clearly. And then from there, it became very clear that I wanted to be on the edges and kind of the fringes of sort of institutional work, and fell in love with the unsheltered population. I worked with Church Under the Bridge in Waco when I was there, and doing similar work now in Galveston. So I don't have one of these stories of like I was doing cocaine in the back of a bus in Mexico when God spoke to me, kind of conversion stuff, but just the steady faithfulness, I think, of church folks for the last 35 years has been a gift.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting. I mean, I also don't have a cocaine in the back of a van experience, but also grew up unchurched and really turned off by church people, if I'm really honest, from high school and college. I felt like they were trying to sell me something I thought I had already bought, but I definitely didn't feel like anybody was trying to get to know me. And then I spent some time overseas and met some people in the Czech Republic who shared a relational God, and through their relationship with me and their way they talked about God, and I never heard God talked about in that way. And I thought, yeah, I could maybe get on board with that. When I moved back home, a friend invited me to Deer Park United Methodist Church, and there that same relational God was offered in a way that I had never experienced as a high schooler or even college student. And so about a year after joining the church, I started my path to ordained ministry. I was working for nonprofits and decided that Jesus was the best mission I wanted to be a part of. And quickly just kind of started taking those steps to be a part of that. And so have done most of my discipleship in the church, and yet have continued to have a heart and eyes and ears for the unchurched, and to see how some of the things we say and do don't make sense to a lot of people if they weren't raised in it. And maybe because I wasn't raised in it and had to learn so much. And so can kind of see where the things that long church-going people really value, that those of us who have come in later have to learn. And I'll be honest, still I don't really understand.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I asked that question is I think always people are interested to kind of hear our unique faith stories, but also to kind of underline, we all have faith today, and most of us are a part of Christian communities, we've decided. Yet a third of Americans today report zero desire of wanting to be a part of church or Christian community. They don't report a lack of interest in God or Jesus, but they do report that they have no desire of being a part of church. And so my question is, why do you think that is? As folks who have found goodness and love and maybe even new life through Christian community and through churches. Why do you think a third of Americans are not interested today?
I'll start. I was looking at me start. I remember one of my first jobs was at Catholic Charities. It was downtown, and I drove downtown one day, and there was this protest, and I'm not even sure what they were protesting, but it was some really ugly signs about a certain group of people and statements about God and very just rigid, unloving, unkind things. And I felt embarrassed because that didn't reflect my heart. That didn't reflect my understanding of the Bible very well. But if that's kind of the public persona, is that Christians are judgmental, Christians are very compartmentalized. We're one way Sunday morning and then a different way Saturday night. That erodes the trust. I think that people need to see consistency. They need to see it carry through. And when that doesn't happen, it creates a lot of suspicion and doubt, not necessarily doubt of God, but like you're saying, doubt of the person standing in front of you.
That's so good, Leah. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think, yeah, and just explicitly naming like homophobia as like, I think a big reason that people have walked away from the church. I think the hypocrisy that we see in institutional leadership, the fall of some high name folks, where I think that's two ways. I think the church has put leaders in a impossible situation as sort of being the model of perfection for what things are supposed to look like. I think the culture has also kind of supported that. So those falls from grace, I think, can be really traumatic from folks when they happen. But I think two other things to kind of emphasize. I was with Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who was the Dean of Duke Divinity. Maybe when Mike was there, I don't know.
Before my time.
Before your time. I forget how old you are.
He's a great preacher.
He's great. And he's in London. And he had this great little line where he said, people stopped being interested in church when church stopped doing interesting things. And I think that's so true. And the current, especially Western model of church and the American expression of it, I mean, we farmed out so many of the things that I think the early church was marked by: caring for the poor, this kind of life. It's turned into this very consumeristic, capitalistic kind of thing where I go, I receive the product, I put my money in the offering basket to say thank you for receiving this, and that's kind of the end. It's a hyper-individualistic thing. And frankly, there's other places that do that better, right? And so with the digital marketplace that exists, I can go to other spots and find that. And so I think some of it is we're just boring people to death, right? My friend Matt says, he says the church is answering questions that people are no longer asking, right? And so I think there's an issue of relevance. I think there's an issue of, is this institution actually making a difference? Like, I remember when our previous bishop asked, if your church were to disappear tomorrow, would anybody in your community actually notice, and would it make a difference? And I'm afraid that for many of ours, the answer is no, apart from the few folks that maybe show up and keep that going. So there's a lot of beauty. I think I'm being very negative right now, but I think that's why a lot of folks have kind of stepped away. And then, Mike, I'm gonna let you go too, but I also think we have an obsession with certainty right now. And faith and certainty are not the same thing. And so some of the religious folks that I've met, there's no room for wonder and awe and mystery. I have my 10 points on the website about the things that I believe, and if you don't fall into these things, there's no space and there's no margin for you. And so I think we've given up on sort of this curiosity, wonder, spaciousness, a God that's big enough to kind of handle all of those things instead of 10 points on a website. So, Mike, what do you think?
I think ditto to everything that's been said. Most of the friends that I went to high school with, so when I was a part of that, part of the charismatic movement in my adolescent years, I have such vivid memories of my friends and I staying up all night, praying, seeking God, worshiping together, crying, and I would say about 90% of them are no longer affiliated with the church. And whenever I catch up with them, several of them do have like negative interaction with the church, but many of them are just interested in spending time with their family on a Sunday morning. They're interested in making sure that they can have peace of mind financially, and so they're focused on their career and their work. And the church, they're not asking these existential questions, or if they are, they're not seeking those answers in the church. It's a miracle if they show up to a church service, but even when they do show up, whatever is being discussed, the songs that are being sung, they seem to be so compartmentalized from the rest of their lives. That being said, there are churches that are rapidly growing in America. And so, and the reason why people go to church or don't go to church, I think it's kind of dangerous for us to assume why people do behave certain ways. But I think what you guys are all pointing to is true, that the human existence, we all long for connection with the divine and to participate in something that has greater meaning than just our own selves. So I think I don't think this is bad news for church folks. I think just as every generation of church, every era of church has had to pay attention to what God is doing and what the Spirit is doing, I think we're living in a time where everybody that's a part of church needs to do that work and have a more imaginative, curious mindset about what it looks like to participate in the work of God's kingdom, more so than perpetuate these traditional boxes or models that we think of when we think of local church.
Yeah. I would definitely agree that there is potential. I mean, I think that's the reason I like to point this statistic out and even try to have these conversations is so that we'll maybe begin to think about things differently. The first step of dealing with a problem is you got to admit that there's a problem, that there's a reality. And even just this notion that we, are living in a post-Christendom world where people the question is not where do you go to church? It's, what do you do on Sunday? Because most people don't go to church, and just that it's not a given anymore. I was talking to a colleague about, the whole Wednesday night thing where everybody went to church on Sunday and on Wednesday night. And, could we bring that back? And I just thought, that's not where our world is anymore. What are some other questions we can ask? And I agree, Leah. I think that it's predominantly is that the church has a rap for being judgmental. That's the number one thing people say about church. We're judgmental, and then we're hypocrites. So we have this one judgment, but we don't even live by it. And then, there's so many other things that come across more fulfilling to do on a Sunday morning. I have church folks who say, I won't make it on Sunday. I have to do laundry. And that's a fair response. I don't know what their week was like. I don't know how much laundry they have. But I also know how much peace of mind I have when all of my laundry is clean and I'm ready for the week. And so just
you got to do laundry church, just like all.
Hey, that's a wild idea. Let's meet at the washateria and have some real conversations. Actually, you say that just a couple weeks ago, an older member of our congregation told me they used to have a Bible study at the washateria. And I thought, there you go. There you go. You're going where the people are. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've seen just in my short experience with church, which is about 10, 12 years, is that the churches in general, we're really focused on building churches.
Yes.
We're really looking forward to how do we make our church bigger, better, more, whatever. And it seems like there's more talk and or activity that's focused on that versus sharing the kingdom, proclaiming the kingdom, being the kingdom of God. And so I think that's where I see why a lot of people have said, I don't need another club. I don't need another to-do thing. I don't even need another group of friends, even though we are very lonely and isolated, that the church has gotten to the business of kind of building the church versus proclaiming the gospel and living like that. And if all those things are true, what is our response? What do we do as faithful church people who love Jesus and know the value and beauty in gathered community?
Yeah, I think we just tell people they're going to hell and just, wipe our hands of it and be done. No, I'm totally teasing. So, no, I think, Yeah, I think the shift away from churchianity is what we might call it, right? This building up of empires and looking, like I'm thinking about your friend that told you, I'm not going to be there, I have to go do laundry. And I imagine the anxiety in her voice of feeling like she's letting you down potentially or something like that, which speaks to the way that we valued, she's worried about metrics that you have to fulfill with how many butts are in seats and how many dollars come in the baskets. I mean, what if we shifted all of our metrics, the UMC that Mike and I are part of, and Thea as well.
Me too.
Sorry, you get to be included in that too. Rethinking all these kind of metric things, right? Like, how do we measure things like kinship and abundance and generosity, rather than, again, these more like institutional kind of numbers that are just about really empire building, rather than, if we want to use kingdom language, kingdom building. Those are two very different sorts of things. And so I think what we've tried to do at Central, when I read the scriptures, God seems to show up wherever people are crying out, right? And so, we get folks all the time that are coming in and saying, I'm really wrestling with my walk. I want to find where sort of God is in this. And a lot of it's because they become so insulated from where the cry is. And so our work in the community becomes sort of this visible, tangible expression that this is a place for good. This is a place that's forming people in a particular kind of way. And while I may not have God, Jesus, Bible sorts of language, that's too abstract for me. I can put my hands here and I can do this load of laundry for some. You mentioned laundry. I mean, we got a laundromat at Central, right? I can help in our free clinic for people to get access to healthcare. And I think we need to put sort of skin and bone on some of these abstract sorts of things. And give people permission to engage with that in whatever ways that they need to. Again, opening this up towards more curiosity and wonder. So where are people already engaging with the divine and with transcendent kind of practices? And how do we sort of, as clergy or church folks or whoever, like bless where that is and help people live into that more fully, rather than converting them to our corner of the kingdom?
Yeah, I think speaking to the metrics piece, I know so many anxious pastors because Sunday keeps coming. They need to preach an awesome sermon, right? Which you guys do, I'm sure.
Every week.
Yeah, and then like your success, generally speaking, is determined not by how prophetic or how sincere your message was, but will the group of people that showed up come back the next week? And will they continue to give financially? And so the entire structure and system, it is kind of like designed to create people-pleasing, anxious human beings. And that translates. Like people can feel that. So I think, I love how you framed the question. If we can disentangle God's kingdom with a tax-exempt 501c3 religious house of worship and ask, what does it look like to build God's kingdom, and start there, and also disentangle sainthood with professional salary W-2 employees of the church who've gone through an ordination system. And this sounds so obnoxious, but read the New Testament and ask, what does it look like to take these words seriously? So about a year ago now, our online church pivoted to being a organization that creates resources. And so I shifted from being like the pastor that wears all these hats that tries to make sure this thing is still floating, to being just kind of a creator. And I got all this time back in a day. And that was my prayer. I remember that morning, Lord, how shall I serve this world, and how shall I serve your kingdom? And from then till now, I've done something that I've always wanted to do but never had time to do, is I've participated in this weekly prison ministry. And there's no compensation. It's just me trying to be faithful to what I hear God's voice. And I don't think you need to be a pastor to pray that prayer. And the camaraderie that I've built with other volunteers in that prison has felt more like a collection of people seeking to serve God. And some of us go to church together on a Sunday, but it's the spirit of that camaraderie is we're being drawn into this work that Jesus very clearly calls us to do in Matthew 25. And it's like, do you want to label that church? To me, it's really insignificant what you call church and what you don't. What matters is, are we creating lifestyles that deepen our a life of prayer and help people?
Thank you.
Just to echo that, I just hear both of you all saying the call is not to go to church. The call is to be the church. That the mission field is the ground between your own 2 feet. I can't remember who said that, but that's something that's stuck with me. So the question is, how do we love whoever is in front of us? And to remember that we're never going to look into the eyes of someone that Jesus doesn't love. And if we start there and we start with relationship building, that's how Jesus always did his ministry. That's how the apostles always did their ministry, was relationship first, and then trusting the Holy Spirit with the rest. Whether they come to church and how often they come to church and, where the church is located, those details, I think we can hold that very loosely.
Yeah, and yes. And then I think language is also something that we have to think through too. And Leah was sharing a little bit about her work before we started recording around trauma stuff. So my wife is a occupational therapist, and so she works at Tier in Houston. She works with folks that have had traumatic brain injuries and helps them. My father-in-law likes to remind me that that's why she married me, for practice, right? So, but she encounters folks that experience what's called aphasia, which maybe folks listening might have a loved one that's experienced that. But when you have trauma to the language center of your brain, it affects the way that you understand speech and the way that you produce speech. And so, like, you may have a cup of coffee in front of you, and I know exactly what this is, but I can't find the word in my toolbox to call this coffee. I might call it chair or microphone or something else that's in front of me. Or I'm listening to Thea talk, and she says the word coffee, and I have no idea what that is. I can't locate it in my brain. And I think there's like a theological aphasia that's happening right now in our community, especially post-2020. I know earlier you mentioned all the way maybe back to 2001 with 9/11, where folks have experienced this kind of collective trauma, and our theological language isn't working anymore. So, folks go into a church and they see a guy like me behind the pulpit preaching a sermon, and they can't make sense of any of the language that's coming at them. It doesn't relate to anything the other 6 days of the week that they're experiencing. There's no sense of relevance. Or they have these real encounters with the divine outside of a traditional church setting, in a laundromat, surfing in Pasadena, California, right, or wherever that may be. But they have such limited language, they can't find anything to describe that experience. And I think a lot of folks walk away then from the church because of this language issue. You think about church words that we use, they're so weird. We talk about blood a lot, and like, what other space do you go to that thinks through that? And so making sure that we're moving towards people. My wife, the therapeutic techniques are these large gestures, right? So when you can't find words, you use your body in different ways. And I think, again, this service work that we're talking about, the being the church that Leah mentioned, these are almost these therapeutic ways for folks to move past some of the language stuff, reclaim some language. Name that there's some words out there that are wounded. I still break out in hives when I hear the word like evangelism, because what that's meant historically for me. But what a beautiful word. And how do we come back alongside and think through how do we reclaim that in a really positive, life-giving sort of way that isn't exclusive or damning or anything like that. So yeah, language I think is a really important part of this too.
Yeah, I also love that you brought up trauma, because I think along with maybe our poor image, there have been some real church hurt. I think one of you mentioned another, name falls, another big pastor has a moral failure, and the rest of the world says, yep, that's what they do. This is why. Or we experience it. I've only been in, vocational ministry for about 8 years. I've been a church-going Christian for 12, and I've had multiple places where I've already experienced great church hurt. And so when you see that that's also another reality where people have either seen it from afar or have a distant connection or have really experienced themselves, why is it that that hurt is different? Why is it the church hurt? Why do we even have to have that qualifier on it? Church hurt, why does it hit differently? And then again, what is our response to that?
So what can show up in my office is a form of betrayal trauma. That if you're told that God is good and God loves you and hey, follow these rules and this is what's going to happen, and then your life doesn't pan out that way, it can really deconstruct your view of God, love, church, community. And as you're going through that painful time, if people come alongside you and weaponize the faith, and there's a rush to forgiveness or there's judgment about where you are in your pain, it just creates a lot of wounds from a place that was supposed to be safe. So it makes sense when we have wounds from people who are enemies. That fits, that's congruent. It's not fun, but it's congruent.
Yes.
It may even make sense, like you were talking about your family life. There's a level of acceptance that, okay, this place or this person isn't safe for me. I'm not going to expect that from them. When there's an expectation of safety and it torpedoes, it really creates two wounds. It's a parallel process of healing what happened and then healing all the bad theology behind it.
Yeah, when I meet with new folks that are interested in the church, hi, my name is Michael Geinger, and I'm going to let you down at some point. It's like literally my opening line with folks, because I think we're in, especially church leaders, such a precarious position of you're kind of expected to do some of this model stuff, but we're human too. And so, some of it is just setting clear expectations. But also, I think our current version of church forms leaders in a particular way that are more in line with capitalism than they are maybe with Christianity. And so to be the kind of pastor that ends up being the CEO of sort of this mega organization, there are already all these things that have taken place and sort of, I don't know, shifting of values possibly, speaking very generally. But I think just the model may be broken, that to get to this position of sort of power, there's going to be some failures kind of inherent with a system like that. So how do we reclaim something that's much more grassrootsy? How do we empower lay folk? I mean, really, I think that's what the future of the church is not a clergy class anymore, but kind of everyday folks getting together in a coffee shop like this to have conversations. I think that's really where some of the magic will be going forward.
Yeah, speaking to all of that, I found myself asking, why do I keep getting hurt here? And why do people keep letting me down here? And I kept asking that question until finally I realized what Michael just spoke to is I have this kind of hidden assumption that highly compensated pastors should be self-aware and have a level of spiritual maturity and be immersed in prayer and in the scriptures, and that they should be the kind of people who pay attention and listen and aren't aloof. And I realized that I've been carrying this. And so whenever that assumption, expectation is not met, I feel some sort of way. And then I always position myself in the role of critic or victim. So I'm always thinking about what church should do different, what pastors should do better. And I'm always like, how could they do that to me? I'm always in that posture. And I think I'm still on the journey here, but I think at some point I was like, well, what if the reverse is true? What if being a pastor actually creates these temptations to be narcissistic, to be aloof, to be surrounded by yes men, especially if you're a highly compensated clergy person? And then I started to lower that expectation. And again, as I kind of spoke to, just disentangling sainthood from those expectations. I think that's really hard work, because you feel very justified in saying, well, the church should be a safe place and pastors should be, nice people maybe. But yeah, I think for both sides, right? Whether you're the parishioner or expecting the pastor to be of a certain stature, or you're the pastor expecting church members and parishioners to meet certain expectations of showing up or giving or what have you. Naming these assumptions that we carry and getting off the seat of victim and critic and asking, okay, I've deconstructed this thing to death. and I can talk about my issues to death. And I probably should with a therapist. But at some point, like, what am I gonna build if I believe these words that I'm reading and I truly feel this impulse from what I believe to be God leading me to participate in this kingdom? What does that look like? And grassroots. I don't know, it's kind of scary, right? It's nice to feel the certainty of, well, church will tell me what to do, but to start with your partner or a good friend and say, hey, what does it look like for us to care for the poor and to take prayer seriously together? We don't need to outsource this work to a missions director, right? Like, how can we do this together? I think that requires a lot of courage, and it's a journey to get there from being wounded and hurt. But it's a long journey. And I will also say that I forget where I heard this, but I heard someone say, if the image of God that you were given as a child is one that is damning and angry and judgmental and always asking you to do more, atheism might be a healthy response for a season. So it's a lot of work, right, to unpack trauma and pain. But the work begins with naming those pains and hurts, but then there's this beautiful, messy path of rebuilding that I think, whether inside or outside the church, we all need to do a better job of kind of painting that picture.
I love what this kind of conversation on expectations, because I do think that's where a source of this, church hurt comes from, is we're expecting Christians, whether they're pastors or not, to be better. We're expecting them to have their lives more together. We're expecting them to sin less. And then when they are real, when they're honest, when they're just human, we're shocked. We're surprised. My husband and I joke all the time, well, why is this happening at the church? I'm like, because there's people there. Why is the church flawed? Well, there's people there. Why is the church messy? Because there's people there. And something that I think we've also done as the church is we've tried to hide our messy. Francis Chan says, why don't we show up and put our sins out there for display? Show up and just say, this is where I have sinned. This is where I am a sinner. And what would it be like if that's what our churches were full of, instead of, this is how you fix your sin. This is how you don't have to deal with these things, which in reality, I believe that, yes, through Jesus Christ, the sin is taken away, as in the barrier between us and God is taken away. I am still full of mistakes. I am still full of greed and pride and my own issues, right? And so, but the barrier that I've let that create between me and God has been taken away. But I'm still a messy human. I'm still full of faults. And that's not always the message that is given or presented or even kind of worn in churches. Instead, too often, I think we're all trying to be like the rest of us, trying to look like we're put together. And so when it's obvious we're not, we're like shocked instead of relieved, right? Like, wouldn't it be great if we were just relieved every time a Christian leader had a moral failure? Look, they're a person too. They still need Jesus, just like me. But unfortunately, that's not it, right? I had a friend who shared, it was another one, a very public Christian leader who had an inappropriate relationship with a staff person. And the church came out and said, they've been let go. And she was so disappointed in that church. She said, no, they should have been welcomed back. They should have been invited to the fold. We should have really lived out this truth we claim, that we are forgiven and redeemed no matter what mistakes we make. And so I wonder if that's not a part of that too, is that we take and create this human punishment. I'm not saying it's okay to have inappropriate relations, but it is real, it is honest, and it's human. And don't we believe in a Jesus Christ that says, I love you beyond that? And that is not your identity. You don't have to wear the weight of that sin for the rest of your life. Instead, I'm giving you a new identity. But I don't often see that actually lived out in the churches, and I wonder if that's where some of that hurt comes from.
I've seen both extremes. I've seen churches that kind of shoot the wounded, which we want to stay away from, obviously, and then churches who don't have any accountability or any counseling or boundaries or safety put in place. And both of those end up in very sad places. If you're firing a staff member for a moral failure, particularly if they're married, that means the loss of income, sometimes the loss of the social community, that if kids were going to private school, it has this whole domino effect that we can think is, oh, yep, well, we did the right thing. We got rid of that person. They can't be in ministry, which may be at least partially true. That's not appropriate in that season. But then who is going to come alongside that family and that person and whoever the affair partner was or whatever. So I think either extreme is a mistake, to think that we just cut you off and you're dead to me. Or I've also seen, especially in my counseling office, it is that, well, let's hire a lawyer, let's make this look good, let's get a PR team, and let's hope nobody finds out. So we're called to walk in the light. We're called to speak the truth in love. We don't want to be all love and no truth. We don't want to be all truth and no love. We have to have that balance.
That's great, and it just highlights the idolatry of empire and institution over and against restoration and healing. That's why we want to either fire quickly and have nothing to do with it, or have no accountability to upkeep the institution.
Yeah. All right, we're going to open it up to you guys. We want to hear your questions. We want to hear your thoughts, your comments. I have one, so I need some more. Go ahead and scan that QR code and text in a question. But this is about progressive Christians. So how do you define this, and how do they differ from maybe a stereotypical Christian? Why? I guess maybe a good question is why the definer, right? Why the qualifier there on that word Christian? And maybe that's a piece of the confusing and unappealing part of our world.
I think this is a major problem we have, is we think of Christian as mostly a set of beliefs or political ideology or a religious category, as opposed to a way of life, as opposed to a journey in maturity. And so, we have these categories of evangelical, progressive, centrist. We don't ask questions around like prayer practices, and ask questions around a vision for who you are becoming, questions around spiritual formation. I forgot the question, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no. So the question is, how do you define progressive Christian? Yeah. And how is it maybe different than a non-progressive Christian?
Yeah, it's usually your stance on gay marriage and gay ordination, right? At least in the United Methodist Church, or what used to be. That was the main point of contention.
Yeah, I think LGBTQ inclusion has been a big part of that defining piece. But I think also the way that, like when we call Scripture the Word of God, what does that mean? How do we think about that? And any broad brush stroke is going to be problematic for these categories and labels. Yeah. I think clarity is helpful for folks always. And so, like Mike named, I think there's a risk whenever our churches become these kinds of microcosms for partisan, and I think this is happening more and more right now, where churches really are just little political party kind of things. Not that the church is inherently political. We're talking about how the world is supposed to be ordered and whatnot, but that's different than some of what we're seeing right now. Yeah. So for me, and especially coming off of church hurt stuff, it's been important to have some sort of distinguisher so folks know this is a place where it's going to be safe for me to experience the divine, that I'm not going to experience that same trauma that I experienced earlier. So I think inclusion is a huge piece of that. And even just some access points, I think, too, for how people can come in, what's permitted, what's not. But I think a lot of it's kind of maybe missing the point a little bit.
I think there's a lot of flavors of Christians out there. When I think about the Last Supper and Leonardo da Vinci's lovely painting of that, there was Matthew, a tax collector, who was in bed with the Roman government. And then we have Simon the Zealot. And if you actually understand what the Zealots are, they were a group of people who were so pro-Jewish and so interested in installing the Jewish state and overthrowing the Roman government. They would carry daggers around to stab and assassinate all the Romans when the Messiah installed this Jewish state. We would probably consider that like domestic terrorists today. Both of these men had seats at the table at the Last Supper. Jesus' disciples were often so quick to want to hijack his message to further their agenda of, well, we're gonna be in favor of these people and not those people, right? Jesus never did that.
Yeah.
We all have a seat at his table. He used both of these men in the ministry. They both were welcome. And I think anytime one group says, oh, we've got this all figured out, and if Jesus were here, he would have voted for this candidate, y'all. That's probably someone that's, I just see the agenda being put forth politically. You know, America's a great country. I am so blessed to live here. It's not where we put our hope. The Constitution's a wonderful document. I'm so thankful for it. That's not where my hope is found. Yeah. And if we start to forget that, we've just seen that play out in other countries. It doesn't end well.
Yeah, and Jesus, after he resurrects from the dead, he doesn't go to Rome to overthrow the Roman Empire. He doesn't go to Jerusalem to restore the corrupt temple system. He goes to Galilee, the ordinary villagers, and he calls them to obey my teachings and make disciples. Whenever we get into these tribal categorizations of, well, Jesus is on our side, or we co-opt Jesus for our own agenda or our own progressive or evangelical ideologies, we entirely miss the point of what it means to create a table where Jesus' body is broken for us.
Yeah, I think I would define progressive church as a place where you're allowed to disagree. And I only say that really in rebuttal of what I have seen at more conservative churches, where this is what we believe and this is how you belong by believing these, versus an idea of, hey, you already belong because you're created by God and God's at work in you and we know it. And wherever you are on the issues, that's fine. I say often, like, you do not have to agree with me. You need to figure this out for yourself. The only thing we have to agree on is that we probably won't agree on everything. The only thing you have to be okay with is that we do disagree, and that there are other people who might believe differently. In the United Methodist Church, we baptize babies. Some people think that is the worst thing you could ever do. Well, you don't have to baptize your baby. You just have to be okay that someone else is going to baptize theirs, and that we take that moment to claim that child for Christ, knowing that they'll make the claim on themselves. We also baptize, middle schoolers and high schoolers and adults, and so we say, wherever you are, that's fine. We welcome that. And so for me, I think that's an important piece of, I know that I had to have, and that was something that was inviting and welcoming to me, and something I continue to mourn since our great denominational split is that I've lost so many colleagues and friends and fellow churchgoers who do think differently, who read the scriptures in a different way, and there's no longer this kind of proximity place where we can bump up against each other, and they could push me to try and well, how do I reconcile that? How do I discover that? Or even just hear a different perspective. We have made church so political, as in you're either in or out. You're either with us or against us, versus this kind of understanding that there are a vast array of ways to interpret scripture, to look at it, to experience God and to experience people. And so how might we, learn together through that?
You're naming, Thea, that there's a fundamentalism on both sides of this that I think is equally dangerous and toxic. And so, I personally find myself on the more progressive side of things, and yet it's so easy for that to become identity banner mantra instead of this kind of following Jesus piece that we're talking about. So just being mindful of anything that pulls us towards echo chambers and fundamentalism.
Yeah, and I think there are healthy and unhealthy progressive evangelical centrist churches, right? It's the health of a congregation, the health of a culture of a congregation is not determined actually by their dogma as much as it is by a culture of kindness and gentleness. We got to be careful how we categorize churches.
Okay, this question came in. It's kind of under the idea that we've been talking a little bit about kind of the old ways of maybe doing church or how church has been done, and then even some new and innovative ideas have come.
Laundry church, we're doing it. Laundry
church. I'm 100% in. But how do you balance that? How do you balance this respect and upholding of tradition and long sacred history with a changing world, a world that is different, and like I said, this whole kind of post-Christendom, a whole cultural shift as well, with also our call to reach people. I don't read anywhere where Jesus says, build a big building and cry because nobody comes. I read him say over and over, go, love, heal, feed. And so how do we balance that hold of what was before and what is still to come?
Well, piggybacking off of what you all just said, I think there's a lot of spiritually homeless people, and we can be curious about how to create that home. It doesn't have to be in a church building with a cross on the top. It can be. There's nothing wrong with that. So we went to a church at one point, and they did a lot of things in the home, and one of the pastors explained it's very important for children to understand that church is not the only place where spiritual things happen. And to do life and have small groups or connection groups, whatever, life groups, whatever you want to call them, in people's homes. So no, we don't have to have this concept of the only way to reach God is when I'm wearing a dress on Sunday with a bow in my hair, and I have these shoes, these uncomfortable shoes on my feet, and that's when, no, it can be anywhere. So just holding that very loosely. Jesus did church, fishing, in kitchens, at the temple, in public, in private, in gardens. Yeah. He just went where the door was open.
I don't think you need to tear anything down. No. And for some people, that $1 million organ is like how they experience God. Like when that organ hits and the organist is doing the thing with the feet, it's just like they're instantly in the presence of God. And I don't think anyone is saying, let's do away with the organ, unless like you have to sell it because you like there's nobody giving any money and like you need to repair it or whatever. But we don't need to tear anything down. And I actually, because I interact with a lot of church planters and people doing ministry in different ways, I think it's important that we do it in partnership with all people in the body of Christ. And yeah, like we could sit here and talk for days about what's wrong with the church, but if we tried, we could also talk about all the ways God shows up and has shown up throughout generations, in and through the church. And so, I don't think there is we need to abolish church and traditional models of church, but I do think that the Spirit often is pushing us for supplemental and alternative modalities of spiritual community that center around the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think there's a way to see innovation as something that's incredibly traditional. Like if you, what Jesus is doing is some reform kind of stuff throughout the New Testament. And so we can look back. A lot of times when people talk about tradition, they're only talking about something that existed in the 1950s. Like even in the scope of Christianity, it hasn't necessarily been tradition. And so I think that context is important of what are we actually longing for. And then to Mike's point, I was in London about a month ago, and we were visiting with Rachel Summers, who does Forest Church. It's off of the Forest School kind of movement, and they literally meet in the woods. And it's this beautiful, very different, I would be totally uncomfortable with it, but loved that they were doing it. But she had this analogy of the big trees that were growing in the forest and this kind of being institutional, traditional church, and then the sticks that we were finding on the ground. And she named that a stick, you can never put it back on the tree. It's never going to go back. But all these other things that a stick could be, whether it's, use your imagination, a wand or a spoon or a staff or something. And I think the key then is for those for whom the tree has provided shade and refuge, to name the stick is still legitimate, and vice versa. And I think what both folks here have named is we get into trouble when we start doing too much critique of this isn't valid, this isn't legitimate. And so how do we bless each other? Even if this expression of church is not something that, maybe I'm not an organ guy, or maybe I'm a contemporary music person or whatever. How do we bless each other and name that all these paths are important and point us to a God who's bigger than any one of our particular traditions, right? And then maybe getting back to the chords of what is it that we're doing here? Like, is it preludes and maybe it is, or is it something about being together and tending to this divine space? I think that's important.
This is going to be the last question. I'm kind of mushing two together. As we're thinking about what we value, right? I heard a clergy friend talk recently of like, we might need to have a value shift when it comes to church today, because we may be clinging to values that we have placed. Again, you brought up the 1950s. We're maybe valuing a feeling we think we had back then, because there is this thing called nostalgia, where things appear better than they were. And so we're valuing a time that we think was better. And then we've kind of attached all of these practices or pieces into that meaning. And so as we kind of hold that, in our hands with this notion of, well, there are people who are spiritually homeless and spiritually lost and craving connection and relationships and authenticity. What is it that we should be offering? What is it that people should be looking for if that's where they are? And then how should the church respond if those people dare show up and or stop showing up? What should we be offering, and how do we really respond to people who actually come looking for it?
That's a good question. I always start with safety. That's my own value system, is got to be safe. And I talk a lot to my clients that are looking for that spiritual home, and they have been burned of, what would a safe community look like for you? What would say safety? What would say not, unsafety? And there's a lot of questions there all at once. So how can the church respond? I think being curious, giving the gift of curiosity of what, where this person is in their own particular journey, asking the hard questions of, where are you with Jesus? So, what do you believe? What have you been taught? Where do you see God in this struggle? Or how has God showed up? And just opening up that dialogue. It doesn't have to be Sunday morning. Again, it certainly can be. Lends itself well to that. But with your neighbors, with your kids, when you're in the car, whatever mission field God has called you to be a good listener in that.
I love that idea of listening. I think we Christians do a lot of talking. I know we pastors do. So I love that. Just maybe some listening.
Should you repeat the question?
Speaking of listening,
Just,
right, Mike?
Yeah, right.
Just holding in, context, everything we've talked about today and these real issues. So what should the church be offering? And how should the church respond when people actually come looking for that?
I think churches, we try to do too many things. And especially, I know in the last 9-10 years I've been a professional Christian, I've heard a lot of talk about how do we get younger and how do we get more diverse. And I've literally seen, I don't know if you need to edit this part out, but I've literally seen like a all-white church try to play gospel music, and it was like really bad. I was like, this reminds me of when my mother tried to make spaghetti, and I was like, can we stick to Korean food? Like, this would be a lot better. And owning like the uniqueness of your congregation, I think can be a gift. So my wife and I and our two daughters, we worship in a kind of stereotypical mid-sized United Methodist church, lots of boomers, and we stick out. But I don't need them to I don't want the church to play Korean music or something weird. I want to celebrate that they're doing Meals on Wheels, they're doing prison ministry, they're doing work with the homeless community, and I want to join in with them, and I want to invite people in my sphere to participate in the good work that this church with its unique context thrives in. And so I think every church has something that y'all are doing right, hopefully, right? And just celebrate that and lean into that. And you don't have to be the church that fixes all the world's problems, but you can celebrate what God is already doing in the ways that you reflect God's kingdom already.
Yeah, and then I think doubling down on that, creating partnerships with other local faith expressions, right? So, we welcome a lot of folks into our community at Central, and I've also helped so many folks exit our community at Central to go find other places where they can better, if you're looking for a kids ministry that's going to be typical, having former gang members and people doing drugs and the things that show up at my church, this is not going to be the space for you. But we've partnered with a fantastic church just down the street that has a phenomenal kids ministry, and we get to bless you kind of on your way out the door. And so I think recognizing that spirituality, the divine, God, whatever your framing is so much bigger than our local expressions. And how do we not create territorial gang kind of things and instead bless people? If the goal is to help them engage with God, that can happen in many places. And so clarity, safety, I think all of these things are just so important for the way. And diminishing of ego, right? We have our role to play at Central and Galveston, but there's a lot of other churches doing amazing things on that island, and I'm so grateful for that. And non-church spaces. So part 2 of this then, I think, is paying attention to if folks aren't gathering at church, where are they gathering, right? What if we did a case study of lit coffee shop bookstore, right? Where people are showing up and having these experiences. So what could the church learn from a place like this and the welcome and hospitality that we experienced here today? Or CrossFit, where you guys met, right? Or all these different places that folks are finding their third space that may no longer be the church. I think paying attention to that, blessing those places, and then maybe learning from them, while not throwing the whole thing out either, like we've talked about before.
Yeah. Well, and what I heard you say, which I would definitely agree with, is be real. Be you. Again, maybe one of the problems with church in general is we continue to try to be all things to all people when we're just supposed to be a reflection of Jesus Christ in our own little unique ways. And so I think be real and be okay if someone doesn't feel comfortable with you. And that, again, don't take that as a blow to your ego or your value or your worth or even your identity. And then I would also say, yes, we have got to look at where people are gathering and be willing to go there. Be willing to be less concerned about building an empire and be more concerned about sharing the gospel and being the light to the world. I mean, Jesus Christ tells us we are the light. And so to go out and be that way and be less worried about what makes us feel important and valued and even safe. And when it comes to, will this church last? I know a lot of churches are asking that question as they're getting older and seeing that that maybe they won't. And guess what? Churches close all the time. And Jesus Christ is still king. And so we can hold on to that and be real. What would be your kind of closing remarks today? We've talked through what would be the hope that you would offer for our guests, but also for anyone listening as they're struggling with just the realities of church today. What would be the hope that you'd like to offer?
Yeah, I think first just a naming of the courage for folks that have experienced church hurt that have stepped back in. We have so many folks at Central and other places that I've met that I'm if I had your experience, there's no way I would be here on Sunday morning. So just a deep gratitude for those that have the space to step back in. Thank you for that courage. And for those who may never be able to again because of the hurt, it's okay. It's okay. And I hope you find spaces to be able to engage with some sort of transcendence, whatever that may look like for you, whether that's through therapy or through CrossFit or whatever, but to stay connected to other people, I think. And then for those of us in the church on maybe the more hurting, trauma-producing side of things, to slow down a little bit, to have this posture of curiosity. It's one of my favorite words, curiosity, because I always thought, I'm gonna nerd out for a second, but that C-U-R, I always thought it was from the Latin cur, C-U-R, which means why, which makes a lot of sense for curiosity, asking why. But it comes from the Latin word cura, C-U-R-A, which is where we get our English word cure, to heal from. So there's something about when I'm open to you, when I'm curious about who you are, when I move towards you, because I'm going to love you, I've got to be curious about you. That's when healing seems to take place, and wonder and love and all these kinds of things. So for those of us that find ourselves in institutional trauma-producing organizations, opening up a little bit, being curious, sense of wonder, I think.
Go see a therapist.
Mic drop, yeah.
5 out of 5 stars. Highly recommend. Whenever I read the Bible, it always just strikes me that Jesus never valued the institution over the individuals in the institution.
Yes.
And we are not, we're to walk that out as well. We can hold both in high regard. We can value the individuals within that institution and value the institution. It's not a competition. But I think whenever there was friction, Jesus always went with the individuals. And that's just something I try to keep in the forefront of my heart.
So good.
Something I remind people, especially when they want to be baptized and or even join the church, that the reason why we do it on a Sunday morning in community is because while this is a deeply personal relationship with Jesus Christ, with God, in the flesh, it's not designed to be private. And I say that to say that you need to find someone you can talk to about your wonderings and your curiosity and your hurt and your pain. And so that would be my hope too, that, you'd be willing to talk to somebody, ideally your spouse, your parents, your children, if those are safe places. And if not, then, maybe a church is where you could find somebody, or maybe it is at a coffee shop or CrossFit, but you've got to be willing to have those conversations and be willing to dig in. And that would be my hope, that you would be willing to share and receive what God is doing in others. And I think that will also continue to show and reflect what God is doing in you. One of the beautiful things about this God in the flesh, really right here amongst us. So thank you, each of you, so much for your time. Thank you for your honesty and your courage to share how you really feel and what you really think. And thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to invite our musicians back up. This is Jesse Hayes and Chris Bolware, who lead worship sometimes over at New Song Worship. They're just going to close us out with one song, and then we're going to be around if you have any further questions, you want to talk more. So thanks. Real Talk Podcast is produced by First United Methodist Church, Pearland, in collaboration with Pearland Podcast Studios, recorded here in Pearland, Texas. We invite you to check out our website at fumcpearland.org to check out additional events and opportunities for you to engage in real talk about faith and relationships.